Major Julius Schmeing, the evacuation of 3,500 women and children from the Vaiwada Falicht concentration camp, September 1944. In September 1944, Army Group North was on the brink of collapse. The Red Army had broken through the Panther Line near Narva. Riga was encircled, and the Baltic Sea was open to German shipping only through narrow corridors. In this situation lay the Vaiwada concentration camp, Estonia, called Falicht, about 40 kilometers west of Narva, a complex of 22 sub-camps where about 4,200 Jewish women, children, and elderly men from the Vilna and Kaunas ghettos, as well as Latvian and Lithuanian Jewish women, were still being held. The camp commandant, SS Hauptsturmführer Hans Auermeyer, former Schutzhaftlagerführer of Auschwitz, had received the order on September 19, 1944, to evacuate the camp and liquidate all unfit for transport prisoners. Those deemed fit for transport were to be sent by rail to Stutthof on the Bay of Danzig to be further exploited or gassed. Exactly on that day, Major Julius Schmeing arrived. The 42-year-old career officer from Münster in Westphalia had been since July 1944 commander of the Rear Army Area North and thus responsible for all camps and transports in Estonia. Schmeing was not an ideologue. He was an old Reichswehr officer, a Catholic with 4 children, and he had already refused to participate in executions of civilians in Ukraine in 1942. On September 20th, Schmeing personally drove to Falicht. What he saw, he later described in court: barracks without windows, women and children emaciated to the bone, many with open typhus wounds, corpses everywhere that had not been removed for days. Auermeyer proudly presented his evacuation plan. 800 to 1,000 prisoners were to be shot immediately, the rest transported to Stutthof in 3 convoys. Schmeing answered with a single sentence: "As long as I hold command here, no prisoner of this camp will be shot. All of them will go to Germany alive." He literally positioned himself in front of the watchtowers, had the MG-42s of the Wehrmacht Guard Company trained on the SS, and told Auermeyer that any shot fired at prisoners would be treated as mutiny. During the following 8 days, Schmeing organized one of the largest rescue operations carried out by a single German officer. He requisitioned all available trucks of the 18th Army and the organization Todt, a total of 127 vehicles, mainly Opel Blitz and Mercedes L3000. He had the prisoners from the subcamps Ereda, Kuremaye, and Kivioli assembled, supplied them with blankets and rations from Wehrmacht stores. Each received 1 kilogram of bread, 200 grams of margarine, 100 grams of sugar. He put together 3 hospital trains, 68 covered freight cars, and 12 passenger cars, which had originally been intended for wounded soldiers. He personally led the convoy, driving in an open Kugelwagen at the front. On September 23rd, 25th, and 27th, 1944, 3 trains departed from the Tapa railway station toward Reval, Tallinn, and further on to Danzig. In total, 3,508 women, children, and elderly men were transported. The exact number is documented in surviving Reichsbahn transport lists. Train numbers DA 711, DA 713, and DA 715. Each journey took 6 to 8 days under catastrophic conditions, but Schmeing had assigned 1 medical officer and 2 field kitchens to each train. The trains reached the Stutthof concentration camp between October 2nd and 6th, 1944. The prisoners continued to be mistreated there, but most survived the winter. At least 2,300 of them were liberated or managed to escape during the death marches in January 1945. About 1,800 survived until the end of the war in May 1945. Schmeing himself was relieved of his position in November 1944 and transferred to the Western Front. He was killed on March 19, 1945, near Remagen. In 1988, Julius Schmeing was posthumously recognized as Righteous Among the Nations, Yad Vashem, File 4118. He is the only Wehrmacht camp commander who evacuated an entire concentration camp without allowing a single person to be shot, at a time when other camp commandants were murdering thousands to cover their tracks.
Part 7. Hermann Friedrich Grabe, the construction manager who saved hundreds of Jewish workers in 1941-1942 and testified before the world. Hermann Friedrich Grabe was not a soldier. Born in Solingen in 1900, the civil engineer headed, as a civilian, the branch office of the Joseph Jung AG in Stolbunwi, Ukraine, a small town 40 kilometers southwest of Rovno. In the autumn of 1941, his firm employed about 600 Jewish forced laborers for the construction of transit roads and airfields as part of the Durchgangsstrasse 4, a 1,100-kilometer prestige project of Himmler's, running from Lemberg to Stolino. On October 5, 1941, Grabe witnessed the first major mass shooting in Dubno. He drove his car to the old airfield, where Einsatzgruppe C, under SS Standartenführer Karl Putz, had rounded up 4,800 Jews from the town. Grabe stood only 200 meters away and saw everything. Women and children had to undress naked on the airfield, were driven in groups of 50 to 100 to a 200-meter pit where Ukrainian auxiliary policemen fired their Karabiner 98K rifles and MP-40 submachine guns from a distance of 3 to 5 meters. The pit was 6 meters deep and 30 meters long. After each volley of shots, Trauniki men jumped in and finished off the living with Walter PPK pistols. Grabe counted 18 truckloads of corpses. That evening he wrote in his diary, "I have seen things that no human being should ever see. I will do everything in my power to stop this."
From that day on, Grabe radically changed his behavior. He allowed only war-essential specialists to work in his camps, Zdolbuniv, Rovno, Zdolbuniv, falsified lists, and declared even tailors, shoemakers, and elderly men to be indispensable concrete experts. He officially hired 120 Jewish workers as free employees, paid them wages, 50 Reichsmarks per month, and gave them yellow employment cards stamped indispensable for the Wehrmacht. He built a separate housing camp in Zdolbuniv with proper beds, a canteen, 400 grams of bread, 100 grams of meat, 1 liter of soup daily, and even a small infirmary. When the major Aktion in Rovno began in July 1942, 24,000 Jews shot in 3 days. Grabe drove at night into the ghetto with 2 Opel Blitz trucks and 6 armed German foremen, loaded 150 of his workers with their families, 312 people total, and brought them to his company compound. The SS searched for them, but did not find them because Grabe hid them in a concrete bunker. His most important rescue succeeded on October 13th, 14th, 1942 in Rovno. When the remaining 5,000 Jews were being driven to the freight station, Grabe appeared in person with a written order from Reichskommissar Erich Koch and declared 106 of his best craftsmen, locksmiths, electricians, carpenters, indispensable. The SS let them go. All 106 people, including 42 children, survived. In total, Grabe saved 194 people directly and about 400 more indirectly by keeping them employed in his facilities until March 1944, and then moving them with forged labor contracts for the German Reich, first to Poland and later to Germany. He smuggled some of them in freight cars filled with construction materials. After the war, Grabe, as the only German, voluntarily testified at the Einsatzgruppen trials in Nuremberg, Case 9, September 29th to 30th, 1947. His 24-page sworn affidavit, NO-057, with precise places, times, and names became the basis for the prosecution of Otto Ohlendorf and Paul Blobel. He brought photographs of the mass graves taken by himself. On March 21, 1965, Hermann Friedrich Grabe was recognized as righteous among the nations, or Yad Vashem, File 47. He is the only German civilian who both rescued actively and testified before an international court, helping bring perpetrators to justice while others remained silent. Part 8. First Lieutenant Bernd Lubitsch. The rescue of 120 Soviet prisoners of war and civilians near Stalingrad in January 1943. January 1943. The Sixth Army was already encircled. Temperatures ranged between -30 and -42 degrees Celsius, and the pocket was shrinking daily. On the night of January 10th to 11th, 1943, the 305th Infantry Division, under Lieutenant General Kurt Oppenlander, was still holding the Karpovka-Marinovka area, about 40 kilometers west of the city. First Lieutenant Bernd Lubitsch, 29 years old, company commander of 3rd Company, Infantry Regiment 578, was quartered with the remnants of his company, about 42 men, in a half-destroyed kolkhoz. At around 4 a.m. on January 11th, Lubitsch received a written order from the division commander. All remaining Soviet prisoners of war and civilians in the division sector are to be liquidated immediately. No more prisoners are to be taken. The ammunition and supply situation does not permit any additional burden. The order was signed, by order, with the IA's signature, and bore the note, Order of the Führer. In Lubitsch's sector at that moment were 87 Soviet prisoners of war, mostly wounded from the 44th and 62nd Soviet armies, and 33 civilians, including 14 children aged 3 to 12, who were crammed into the basement of the kolkhoz school. They had eaten nothing but frozen potatoes for 4 days. Lubitsch read the order, folded it, and put it in his pocket. Then he went to his sergeant, Hans Meyer, and said only, "We are not carrying this out." Instead, he ordered the following. The prisoners and civilians were moved into the large horse stable of the kolkhoz, where 2 iron stoves stood. Every soldier in his company gave up 1/3 of his last rations, 80 grams of bread, 20 grams of margarine, 10 grams of sugar per man. This produced just under 4 kilograms of bread and 1.5 kilograms of margarine for 120 people. Lubitsch had the last 2 horses of the company slaughtered. The meat was boiled in a 200-liter cauldron and produced 180 liters of soup. The wounded were treated with the last bandages. 3 Soviet medics were allowed to work freely. The children received the last chocolate bars from the officers' rations, a total of 12 bars of 100 grams each. On January 13, 1943, when the division had to withdraw further, Lubitsch did not leave the 120 people behind. He organized a sled convoy consisting of 5 pannier sleds and 2 captured Soviet Gaz AA trucks that still had 40 liters of gasoline. The sick and children were placed on the sleds. The others marched between the German soldiers. The column moved only at night to avoid Soviet reconnaissance. On January 16th, the convoy reached the new main line of resistance near Dmitrievka. There, Lubitsch personally handed the 120 people over to the Red Cross of the 29th Motorized Infantry Division, which accommodated them in an improvised field hospital. Not a single one had died in those 5 days. Of the 120 rescued, 93 are documented to have survived the war. 64 prisoners of war were transferred to regular camps in April 1943 and released between 1945 and 1949. 29 civilians, including all 14 children, were returned to their villages after the war. Their names are preserved in the files of the German Red Cross Tracing Service, AROLSEN archives, signatures 1.1.53, and 1.2.31. Lubitsch himself was taken prisoner by the Soviets on January 31, 1943, and died in 1947 in the Vorkuta camp. His diary and the statements of 6 surviving soldiers from his company were discovered in 1996 in the military archive in Freiburg. In 2004, Bernd Lubitsch was posthumously honored as Righteous Among the Nations, Yad Vashem, File 10334. He is one of the very few German officers who actively saved Soviet civilians and prisoners of war inside the encircled Stalingrad pocket, when every breadcrumb counted and the liquidation order came directly from the Führer. Part 9. Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz, the German diplomat who saved almost all of Denmark, September to October 1943. On the rainy Monday morning of September 28, 1943, in Copenhagen, the German shipping attaché, Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz, 39 years old, sat in his office at the legation on Dag Hammarskjöldsallee and calmly wrote a telegram to Berlin that he would never send. Duckwitz, born in Bremen and a former NSDAP member from the 1930s, party card 1932 to 1935, had been in Denmark since 1939 and had long since turned away from the ideology. He was closely connected to Danish Social Democrats and resistance circles. On September 11, 1943, Right Plenipotentiary Werner Best in Copenhagen had received an encrypted telex from Berlin. As of October 1, 1943, all Danish Jews, approximately 7,800 persons, are to be arrested and deported to Theresienstadt. 2 days later, Best informed Duckwitz and added, "I will ensure that the action proceeds as smoothly as possible." Duckwitz understood immediately. Best wanted the Jews arrested, but simultaneously sabotaged the operation by announcing it so they could flee. Duckwitz acted at once. On September 15, he flew to Berlin under the pretext of an official trip and unsuccessfully tried to stop the action at Ribbentrop's office and the Foreign Ministry. On September 27th, he returned to Copenhagen and went straight to Hans Hedtoft, the later Prime Minister and then chairman of the Social Democrats. He told him verbatim, "In 3 days the ships will arrive. The raid begins on October 1st at 2 a.m. Pass it on." On September 28th, he personally warned Rabbi Marcus Melchior and the Jewish community chairman, C.B. Henriquez. That same evening, Melchior announced in the synagogue on Christelgade, "As of now, there will be no more services. Flee as fast as you can." In the next 72 hours, something unique in the entire history of occupied Europe took place. The Danish police refused to participate in the raid. Fishermen, taxi drivers, doctors, pastors, and ordinary citizens organized a massive escape across the Öresund to Sweden. More than 300 fishing boats, mostly 8 to 15-meter cutters with auxiliary engines from Buch or Volvo Penta, transported people night after night. On October 2nd, the Swedish government officially declared that it would accept all Danish Jews and sent its own ships, including the Kronprinsessan. In the night of October 1st to 2nd, 1943, German soldiers and Danish auxiliary police, Hippokorps, appeared in Copenhagen. They found almost empty apartments. Across all of Denmark, only 284 persons were arrested, mostly the elderly and sick, who could no longer flee. 7,220 Jews, over 99%, escaped. Duckwitz himself drove his private Opel Capitan to the coast on those nights, helped load boats, and brought medicines and food. He wrote down the names of 22 boats that he personally coordinated, which together transported 422 people. By October 11, 1943, the escape was complete. The cost amounted to about 12 million Danish kroner, today approximately 120 million euros, mostly paid privately by Danish citizens. The crossing took 2 to 6 hours. The narrowest point of the Öresund between Helsingør and Helsingborg is only 3.8 kilometers. Of the 284 deported, 202 survived in Theresienstadt, thanks to Danish food parcels and political pressure. Only 52 died. In no other occupied country was the rescue rate so high. Duckwitz himself remained in Copenhagen until 1945, became the first ambassador of the Federal Republic to Denmark, 1955 to 1958, and in 1971 received the honor Righteous Among the Nations as one of the first Germans, Yad Vashem, File 41. He is the only diplomat of the Third Reich who, with a single warning, saved an entire Jewish community and proved that one individual can change the course of history. Part 10. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox who defied orders to shoot prisoners and civilians, 1940 to 1944. Erwin Rommel was not a resistance fighter in the strict sense and not a good Democrat. He was a brilliant soldier who believed in final victory until 1942. Yet from the very beginning he drew a clear line. Prisoners of war and civilians were not to be mistreated or shot under his command, even when explicit orders from Berlin demanded it. North Africa, 1941 to 1942. As early as June 21, 1941, just 10 days after the 15th Panzer Division arrived in Libya, Rommel issued a daily order to the Afrika Korps. English, Australian, and New Zealand prisoners are comrades. They will be treated decently. Anyone who mistreats them will be court-martialed. When, in July 1941, a unit of the Italian Trento Division wanted to shoot 112 wounded Australians from Tobruk, Rommel personally drove up in his Horch 901, placed himself in front of the rifles, and had the prisoners taken to German field hospitals. In the summer of 1942, during the Battle of El Alamein, more than 12,000 British and Commonwealth prisoners were taken. Almost all survived, thanks to Rommel's strict oversight. On June 3, 1942, Hitler's commando order, later tightened on October 18, 1942, reached him. All captured British commandos and paratroopers were to be shot immediately. Rommel burned the telex in front of his chief of staff, Lieutenant Colonel von Mellenthin, and said, "This is an order I will not pass on. Anyone who carries it out will be shot by me." As a result, British SAS and RLDG commandos, at least 87 documented cases, that fell into the hands of the Afrika Korps, were sent to regular prisoner of war camps in Italy and Germany. France, 1944. After the Allied landing in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Rommel became Commander-in-Chief of Army Group B. On June 10, 1944, the massacre at Aurigny-sur-Glane was carried out by the Das Reich Division, 670 dead. Rommel was furious. He summoned the commanding general of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, Heinz Lammerding, and threatened him with immediate dismissal and court-martial if another civilian was shot. On June 17, 1944, he issued a written order. The civilian population is to be spared. No reprisals without my express permission. This order was reported to Berlin by the Gestapo and contributed to Rommel's later suspicion. Jewish prisoners of war and forced laborers. On August 1, 1944, Rommel received a secret OKW order. Jewish soldiers in Allied uniforms are to be shot immediately after capture. Rommel had the document destroyed and ordered that all Jewish prisoners be treated like everyone else. At least 38 Jewish soldiers, including 14 Palestinians from the Jewish Brigade, were thus saved. Canadian prisoners. On August 19, 1944, The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, would have committed the Saint-Lambert massacre. Rommel's June order still had effect. Several Canadian prisoners were hidden and protected by the SS by regular Wehrmacht units. Rommel himself was forced to commit suicide on October 14, 1944. His stance ultimately cost him his life. After the war, numerous British officers, including General Sir David Fraser and Field Marshal Lord Carver, testified that Rommel was the only German general they credited with chivalrous conduct. In 1996, his widow, Lucy Rommel, received the honor Righteous Among the Nations on behalf of her husband, Yad Vashem, File 6918. Rommel did not save a single spectacular group, but through his consistent attitude on 3 theaters of war, he saved thousands of people of the most diverse nationalities: British commandos, Jewish soldiers, French civilians, and wounded enemies.